For more on this, I want to bring in Joseph Moreno. He is a former U.S. federal prosecutor, and he's joining us from Alexandria, Virginia. So, Joseph, always appreciate you taking the time. We have spoken so many times. What was your initial reaction to this ruling? Were you surprised?
Hi, Andrew. Good to be with you. Well, as you said, it's historic. It's groundbreaking. Thankfully, it's not something we've ever had to deal with before because we've never had a former president criminally charged. I wouldn't say it's a surprise, though. I think most of us have always assumed that if it came to the test, courts would rule that presidents are not immune from criminal prosecution because, as was pointed out by the D.C. Circuit, it would almost give them a free pass to do virtually anything. And so I'll give Donald Trump's team credit. They had some creative arguments, and they might strike a chord at the Supreme Court if it goes that far. But most of us felt this was a really high bar, and not surprisingly, he did not meet it.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's say it does go that far and it does go to the U.S. Supreme Court. What do you expect would happen there?
Well, the majority of this Supreme Court is conservative leaning, right, in a 6-3 majority. Now, that does not mean they're supposed to decide on things based on whether a defendant is conservative or progressive. What it means is that they're supposed to take a very narrow, very literal read of the Constitution and of applicable laws. And there is nothing in the Constitution that grants presidents immunity. In fact, if you look at the impeachment clause and read it basically plain English, it seems to imply that a president can be impeached, removed from office, and then it says, nevertheless, indicted, prosecuted, and tried on criminal charges. So that seems like that's the end of the story there. Donald Trump's argument was basically said, well, look, we'll give that. But in order to move forward on that theory, a president has to be impeached, convicted by the Senate, and then can be criminally prosecuted. It's a careful and creative reading of the Constitution. But again, I think most originalists will look at that and say, yeah, that's a stretch. The plain English seems to definitely indicate a president is liable to be criminally prosecuted. And I expect that's what the Supreme Court will ultimately agree with.
And so when you say ultimately agree with, I mean, how long could this whole process take? If it does, we know that the former president is going to appeal. So how long does it go through that process? And if it does reach the U.S. Supreme Court?
It will go fairly quickly, as it has so far. Donald Trump's team only has 1 week to petition the Supreme Court for an emergency hearing. So assuming he will put in for that, he'll probably get the hearing. And then the question is, will the Supreme Court take the full case? Will they simply delay things and then let the court go forward? Or will they take a full hearing and then really kind of look at the whole matter? That could take a while. I would predict late spring, summer, even fall. And all this while, the trial court, which is here in Washington, D.C., is stuck in its tracks. Basically, jurisdiction is grabbed out of the trial court and resides with the appellate courts. So even if Judge Chutkan wanted to move forward, she can't. And I think ultimately, that's probably Donald Trump's true motivation here. It's probably delay. I think he knows he has a very slim chance to succeed at the Supreme Court. But what he is succeeding at is putting off this trial, most likely in the hopes that he gets reelected this November and then can basically stop the cases right where they stand, because he'll be in charge of the Justice Department effectively.
All right, that was actually going to be my next question, was going to be along those lines in terms of, so this is about whether a former president can be prosecuted. What if Donald Trump does in fact win in November and become president again in January, in a year from now?
Sure. So for the 2 federal cases that Donald Trump is facing, the January 6th insurrection case and the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, if those cases have not yet gone to trial and reached a conviction, and Donald Trump is reelected, then as the head of the executive branch, he can basically kill the cases. He can order his attorney general to stop them in their tracks, shut down Jack Smith and the whole special counsel operation, and basically mothball it. That would be the end. Now, if Jack Smith does manage to get to trial on one or both of these cases before next November and does secure a conviction, then the question arises, well, can Donald Trump just pardon himself? That's never been tried before. But I think, again, a very literal reading of the Constitution is that, yes, a president can pardon him or herself. So either one way or the other, Donald Trump's greatest hope on these federal cases is that he gets reelected and basically can kill them in their tracks. One thing I'll add, none of this relates to the 2 state criminal charges that he's facing. Those continue no matter what. They are not affected by any of this debate about immunity or pardoning or anything like that. So regardless of what happens, those cases in New York City and in Fulton County, Georgia, will move on.
Joseph, always good of you to take the time. Thank you. Joseph Moreno is a former U.S. federal prosecutor joining us from Alexandria, Virginia.